That was the day I stopped being afraid. Standing there in my bedroom, staring into that empty antique chest where my husband's precious collection once lived, I felt something crack open inside me. Not my heart, that had already been shattered into 1,000 pieces over the past 2 years. No, this was different. This was the sound of my patience finally snapping like a dry twig underfoot. The velvet lining still held the impressions of Howard's treasures. 67 years old, and I could still remember the weight of each piece in my hands. The ivory letter opener from our honeymoon in Paris. The brass compass his grandfather carried in the war. The delicate porcelain figurines we'd collected from every anniversary trip. Gone. All of it gone. My hands were trembling as I traced those empty indentations, and I hated that they were trembling. I hated that at my age, I was still discovering new depths of betrayal. I hated that the woman I'd welcomed into my family with open arms had just told me, with that smug little smile of hers, that she'd sold my entire life's worth of memories because they were collecting dust. Collecting dust. As if love could collect dust. As if 43 years of marriage could collect dust. As if every careful selection Howard and I had made together, every story we'd shared over each piece, every gentle handling as we'd wrapped them away for the next generation, as if all of that was just dust. I want you to understand something about rage. Real rage isn't the hot, explosive kind you see in movies. Real rage is cold. It's calculating. It settles into your bones like winter and stays there, feeding on every slight, every manipulation, every lie you've been too polite to call out. That's the rage that was building in me as I stood there, looking at the evidence of Clara's theft. Because that's what it was, theft. No matter how she'd dress it up, no matter how she'd convinced my son Ethan that she was helping me declutter, no matter how many times she'd whispered in my ear about simplifying my life. She had stolen from me. She had stolen my history. What would you have done? Would you have called the police right then? Would you have screamed? Would you have confronted her with tears and accusations? I almost did. God knows, I almost did. But then I remembered something Howard used to say. Evelyn, my dear, the best revenge is a dish served so cold it gives your enemy frostbite. So I closed that empty chest, walked downstairs with my spine straight and my face composed, and I began to plan. But let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you about the woman I used to be, before Clara taught me that trust is a luxury I could no longer afford. Howard and I met in 1954, when I was 19 and he was 22. He was studying art history at the university, and I was working at the local museum, cataloging donations. He had these gentle hands that could hold a 300-year-old vase like it was made of gossamer, and eyes that lit up when he talked about the stories hidden in old things. Every antique is a love letter from the past, he used to say. Someone made it with care, someone treasured it, someone passed it down because it mattered. We built our life around that philosophy. Not just collecting, curating. Every piece in our home had a story, had meaning. The silver tea set from my grandmother's estate. The carved wooden jewelry box Howard bought me for our first anniversary. The hand-painted china we acquired piece by piece over 20 years of careful searching. Each item was chosen with love, displayed with pride, and maintained with devotion. When we'd have family gatherings, when the children were small, Howard would take them around the house like a tour guide, telling them the story of each treasure. Where we'd found it, why we'd chosen it, what made it special. Ethan, my eldest, used to listen with wide eyes as his father explained the provenance of a Civil War-era pocket watch or the significance of a Depression glass bowl. Someday, son, Howard would say, all of this will help you remember us. These aren't just things, they're memories made solid. The chest itself was Howard's pride and joy. Solid mahogany, hand-carved by German craftsmen in 1890. He'd spent 3 months tracking it down through estate sales and antique dealers, and when he finally found it, he'd called me from the shop with such excitement in his voice that I thought he'd won the lottery. Evelyn, he'd said, I found it. I found the perfect piece. This is where we'll keep our most precious things. For 40 years, that chest held our treasures. Not the most valuable pieces, those were insured and stored properly, but the most personal ones. The items that told the story of us. Howard's father's military medals. The locket I wore on our wedding day. The tiny silver spoon Ethan used as a baby. The pressed flowers from our anniversary bouquets. The love letters we'd written to each other during his brief deployment to Korea. When Howard died 3 years ago, I used to sit by that chest in the evenings, opening it slowly, touching each piece like I was touching his memory. It was the only way I could feel close to him anymore. The only way I could hear his voice telling me those stories again. And then Clara came. My son Ethan had been alone for 5 years after his divorce. I'd worried about him, the way mothers do. He'd thrown himself into his work, avoided social situations, claimed he was fine, with that tight smile that told me he was anything but. So when he called me last spring, his voice bright with an excitement I hadn't heard in years, I was thrilled. "Mom," he said, "I want you to meet someone special." Clara was beautiful, I'll give her that. 38 years old, sleek blonde hair always perfectly styled, clothes that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. She had a firm handshake and direct eye contact, and she complimented my home within the first 5 minutes of walking through the door. "Mrs. Holloway," she said. Ethan wasn't exaggerating. "This place is like a museum. You have such exquisite taste." She moved through my living room like she was appraising it, which should have been my first warning. But I was so grateful to see my son happy, so hopeful that maybe this polished, confident woman could bring joy back into his life, that I missed the calculating look in her eyes. "I work in interior design," she explained over dinner. "Well, more than that, really. I help people transition their spaces for different life stages. Downsizing, upgrading, modernizing. I have an eye for what works. Clara has some wonderful ideas about updating your place, Mom," Ethan added, and I could hear the admiration in his voice. "She thinks there are ways to make it more comfortable for you as you get older." As I get older. As if 70 was ancient, as if I was already 1 foot in the grave and needed my living space adapted for my inevitable decline. But I smiled and nodded because I wanted Ethan to be happy, and if Clara made him happy, then I would welcome her with open arms. That was my first mistake. They married 6 months later, a small ceremony in my backyard. Clara wore vintage lace and carried antique roses, and she looked every inch the perfect daughter-in-law. During the reception, she pulled me aside and squeezed my hands. "I want you to know," she said, "how much it means to me to be part of this family. Ethan talks about you constantly, about how you raised him to appreciate beautiful things, to understand quality and craftsmanship. I hope I can learn from you." I actually teared up. I thought I was gaining a daughter, someone who understood the importance of preserving family history, someone who would help me pass down our stories to the next generation. I was actually letting in a fox. It started small. Little suggestions, offered with such gentle concern that I felt churlish for even hesitating. "Mrs. Holloway, can I call you Mom? I noticed you have to dust all these lovely pieces every week. Have you considered rotating the displays? You could store some items and bring out others seasonally. It would be less work for you, and you'd get to appreciate each piece more. Mom, some of these rugs are getting a bit worn. I know they have sentimental value, but they could be trip hazards. What if we found some beautiful, low-pile alternatives? Safer for you, but just as elegant. Ethan's worried about you managing all this space. What if we helped you reorganize? Made things more accessible, more streamlined? You could keep everything you love, just arrange it more practically." Each suggestion was reasonable. Each one came with Ethan's worried agreement, his gentle pressure about my safety and comfort. Each one chipped away a little more at the life Howard and I had built. But the real erosion wasn't about the furniture. Clara convinced Ethan that I needed help managing my finances. "She's getting older," I heard her tell him one evening when they thought I was napping. "These scams targeting elderly people are everywhere. What if someone convinces her to invest in something fraudulent? What if she forgets to pay bills? Wouldn't it be better if you had oversight, just as a safety net? So Ethan started handling my mail. Just the important stuff, Mom. Bills, legal documents. I'll bring you anything personal. Clara would sit with us while he sorted through everything, making helpful comments about simplifying my accounts, consolidating my investments, updating my insurance policies. They had me sign a power of attorney, just in case I ever needed help making decisions. It's just a precaution, Ethan assured me. You're sharp as a tack, but if you ever got sick, if you ever needed someone to handle things temporarily, this way I'd be able to help you immediately. I signed it because I trusted my son. I signed it because Clara was sitting right there, nodding supportively, talking about how responsible it was to plan ahead. I signed it because I never imagined that the woman who'd promised to learn from me was actually planning to erase me. The social isolation came next, though it was so gradual I almost didn't notice. Clara would answer the phone when my friends called, explaining that I was resting or having a difficult day. She'd cancel lunch dates on my behalf, claiming I wasn't feeling well. When I protested, she'd look so concerned, so caring. Mom, I know you want to keep up with everything, but you've been pushing yourself too hard. Yesterday you seemed confused about what day it was. Maybe you just need more rest? We can reschedule with Meredith for next week. Except next week, there would be another excuse. And another. Until eventually, my friends stopped calling, assuming I was no longer interested in maintaining our relationships. People your age, Clara would say gently, sometimes they just drift apart naturally. It's normal. You shouldn't feel obligated to maintain friendships that drain your energy. But I wasn't drifting. I was being cut loose, set adrift by a woman who wanted me isolated and dependent. She controlled my thermostat. The house is too warm, Mom. It's not healthy for someone your age. Let me adjust it to something more reasonable. I'd wake up shivering, and when I'd try to change it back, she'd reset it again. Trust me on this. I've read the studies about optimal temperatures for seniors. She monitored my meals. Those processed foods aren't good for you. Let me prepare something healthier. The healthy meals were always smaller than what I wanted, blander than what I enjoyed. When I'd try to cook for myself, she'd hover, making comments about my confusion about expiration dates, my poor judgment about portion sizes. She decided what was appropriate for me to wear. Mom, that dress is lovely, but maybe something a little more age-appropriate? Here, I picked this out for you. It's more flattering for your figure. The clothes she chose were always looser, more shapeless, the colors more muted. I started to look like an old woman because she dressed me like one. She didn't chain me to my bed. She didn't lock me in my room. She just made the world smaller and smaller around me until I began to feel like I was disappearing entirely. And through it all, Ethan watched with grateful eyes as his wife took such good care of his aging mother. He couldn't see what I was losing because Clara was an artist at making control look like caring. But the antiques, those she saved for last, those required a different kind of manipulation. Mom, she said one afternoon about 6 months ago, I've been thinking about your beautiful collection. Have you considered having it professionally appraised and documented? Not to sell anything, of course, but for insurance purposes. And maybe for the family records? Ethan's children should know the stories behind these pieces. Ethan doesn't have children yet, but the suggestion seemed thoughtful. Responsible, even. So I agreed to let her contact an appraiser. The man who came was professional, thorough. He photographed every piece, noted condition and provenance, estimated values. Clara took careful notes, asked intelligent questions, seemed genuinely interested in preserving the information. What I didn't know was that she was also identifying the most valuable pieces, researching their market value, finding the best venues for resale. Mom, she said a few weeks later, the appraiser mentioned that some of your pieces would be safer in climate-controlled storage. Just temporarily, while we have the house painted and renovated. We wouldn't want anything to get damaged by dust or fumes. The renovation was her idea, of course. Freshening up the space, modernizing the lighting, updating the flooring. All perfectly reasonable suggestions that happened to require moving my treasures out of the house. "Don't worry," she assured me. "I'll handle everything. I know exactly how to pack and transport antiques safely. They'll be better protected in storage than they would be here during construction." I watched from my bedroom window as strangers loaded my life into trucks. Clara supervised, checking items off on her clipboard, directing the careful handling of each piece. She looked so confident, so caring, so responsible. I never saw any of it again. The storage facility was a fiction. The climate-controlled environment was a lie. While I was living in what Clara called temporary simplicity during the renovation, she was systematically selling every piece of value I owned. The brass compass went to a collector in Boston for $800. The ivory letter opener sold to an antique dealer in Philadelphia for $1,200. The porcelain figurines were auctioned online, piece by piece, bringing in over $3,000 total. The silver tea set went to an estate sale in Connecticut for $1,500. My memories, my history, my connection to Howard, all of it converted to cash that went straight into Clara's personal account. And I didn't know. For 6 months, I didn't know. When I'd ask about when the pieces would be coming back, Clara would pat my hand and say, "Soon, Mom. The renovation is taking longer than expected, but we want everything to be perfect before we bring your treasures home." The renovation that never seemed to end. The storage facility I was never allowed to visit. The constant delays and excuses and reassurances that everything was being carefully protected. Until this morning, when something made me check the chest. Maybe it was the way Clara had been avoiding my eyes lately. Maybe it was the guilt I'd sensed in Ethan's voice when he'd called to cancel our lunch plans again. Maybe it was just instinct, the way you sometimes know in your bones that something is terribly wrong. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my arthritic joints protesting every step, and I opened that mahogany chest that had held our most precious memories for 40 years. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. Not even the velvet lining remained. Clara had been thorough enough to remove every trace of what had been there. That's when I knew. That's when the cold rage settled into my bones and made itself at home. That's when I stopped being the polite, grateful, diminished old woman Clara had spent 2 years creating and remembered who I really was. I was Evelyn Margaret Holloway, and I had not survived 70 years on this earth, 43 years of marriage, the loss of my husband, and the loneliness of widowhood just to be robbed blind by a woman young enough to be my daughter. But here's what you need to understand about being 70 years old and furious. You can't just react. You can't just storm downstairs and start making accusations. Because when you're my age, when you've been systematically isolated and made to seem confused and fragile, no one believes you when you say you've been wronged. If I'd confronted Clara that morning, she would have looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes and said, "Mom, what are you talking about? All your things are safely in storage, remember? We discussed this. Are you feeling confused again?" And Ethan would have believed her. Because she'd spent 2 years establishing the narrative that I was declining, that I was forgetful, that I needed their help to manage my life. My word against hers would be no contest. So instead, I closed that empty chest, walked downstairs, and made myself a cup of tea with hands that barely shook at all. Clara was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, probably checking auction prices or bank balances. She looked up when I entered, and her smile was so perfectly crafted, so convincingly warm. "Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well? I was thinking we could work on organizing your closet today. Some of those old dresses are taking up so much space." My old dresses. The ones from when I was young and vibrant and thought I had a future worth dressing up for. She wanted to take those too, to complete the erasure of everything I'd ever been. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said, and my voice was steady. "But first, I think I need to make a phone call." I called Harold Lopez, Howard's old friend and our longtime notary. Harold was 82 now, semi-retired, but he'd known Howard since college and had handled all our important documents over the years. If anyone would remember the details of our collection, if anyone would have records of what we'd owned, it would be Harold. Evelyn, he said, and I could hear the pleasure in his voice. It's been too long. How are you holding up, my dear? Harold, I need your help. I think I'm being robbed. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I worried he'd hung up. Then, tell me everything. So I did. I told him about Clara, about the gradual isolation, about the power of attorney and the storage facility and the empty chest. I told him about feeling like I was disappearing, about being made to feel confused and fragile and grateful for help I'd never asked for. Harold listened without interruption, and when I finished, his voice was hard with anger I hadn't expected. Evelyn, what you're describing is elder fraud. Financial abuse. And if your antiques were properly documented and insured, as I know Howard would have insisted, then we have a paper trail. Can you meet me tomorrow? I could, I told him. Clara would probably object, would want to drive me, would hover during the meeting to make sure I didn't say anything embarrassing. But I would be there. And Evelyn? Don't let on that you suspect anything. Don't give her any warning. If she's been selling your possessions, she may try to destroy evidence or move money if she knows you're onto her. That night at dinner, I played the confused, grateful old woman perfectly. I thanked Clara for taking such good care of my things. I worried aloud about my poor memory and how lucky I was to have her help managing everything. I even asked if she thought we should consider selling some of the less important pieces to help pay for my care. Her eyes lit up. Oh, Mom, that's such a smart idea. Actually, I've been researching the market for some of your pieces just to get an idea of their value for insurance purposes. Some of them might be worth more than you realize. Really? I said, my voice full of innocent wonder. Which ones? And she told me. She actually sat there and told me about the market value of my stolen possessions, explaining which auction houses had the best reputation, which pieces would bring the highest prices, how the money could be invested to provide for my future needs. She was so confident, so sure that I was too diminished to understand what she was really saying. She talked about liquidating my life as if it were a favor she was doing me. I went to bed that night with her words echoing in my head, and for the first time in months, I slept deeply. Because I finally knew exactly who I was dealing with, and I was finally ready to fight back. Harold's office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same heavy wooden furniture, the same law books lining the walls, the same sense of careful competence that had drawn Howard to him decades ago. But Harold himself looked every one of his 82 years, his hands spotted with age, his voice a little thinner than I remembered. Evelyn, he said, rising slowly from behind his desk, you look good. Tired, but good. I suppose I did look tired. I felt tired, down to my bones. Tired of pretending, tired of diminishing myself, tired of being afraid in my own home. Harold, please tell me you have good news. He smiled, and suddenly he looked 20 years younger. My dear, I have excellent news. Howard was meticulous about documentation. Every piece in your collection was photographed, appraised, and insured. We have serial numbers, provenance records, condition reports, everything we need to prove what you owned and track where it went. He spread papers across his desk, insurance policies, appraisal documents, photographs of every piece. Seeing them again, captured forever in those careful images, made my throat close with grief. But also with something fiercer. More than that, Harold continued, I've contacted a forensic accountant who specializes in elder fraud cases. If Clara has been selling your possessions, we'll be able to trace the money. Bank records, auction house sales, online transactions, it all leaves a trail. And legally? What she's done is theft, Evelyn. Grand theft, given the value of what's been taken. It's also elder abuse, which carries additional penalties. If we can prove she's been systematically isolating you and manipulating your assets, she could face serious criminal charges. I felt something uncoil in my chest, something that had been wound tight for 2 years. What do I need to do? First, we gather evidence. I want you to start recording conversations with Clara when she talks about your possessions or your finances. Your phone probably has a voice memo app. Learn to use it discreetly. Second, I want you to request copies of all your financial statements for the past year. Tell her you need them for tax purposes. Third, I want you to start documenting every restriction she places on your activities, every time she speaks for you or makes decisions for you. And then, Harold's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we destroy her. The recording was easier than I'd expected. Clara was so confident in her control over me, so sure I was too addled to understand her implications, that she talked freely about managing my assets and making smart financial decisions for my future. I got her explaining how certain pieces had been temporarily relocated for my safety. I got her discussing the insurance money we could claim if anything were accidentally damaged during the renovation. I got her talking about how liquid assets would be easier for me to manage than all those dusty old things. Most damning of all, I got her on my birthday. My 68th birthday came and went without acknowledgement. Clara was hosting a dinner party that night for her friends, not mine. I wasn't invited to join them, was encouraged instead to rest in my room while they celebrated downstairs. But I didn't rest. I sat at the top of the stairs with my phone, recording every word that drifted up from my own dining room. The old lady stuff brought in more than I expected. Clara's voice was clear and bright with wine and success. Some of those pieces were really valuable. That tea set alone paid for my new car. Laughter from her friends. Someone asking if I knew what she'd done. God, no. She has no idea. Honestly, I think she's starting to lose it a little. She'll ask about the antiques sometimes, and I just remind her they're in storage. She nods and forgets about it 5 minutes later. More laughter. Someone else asking about the house, about when Clara would be able to sell it. Soon. Once Ethan signs the transfer paperwork, she won't be able to stop us. The way I see it, we're doing her a favor. This place is way too big for someone her age. She'll be much happier in a nice senior community where people can keep an eye on her. But what if she objects? What's she going to do? Call the police? She signed over power of attorney months ago. As far as the law is concerned, Ethan has the right to make these decisions for her. And Ethan trusts me completely. That recording was 23 minutes long. 23 minutes of Clara describing exactly how she'd stolen from me, manipulated my son, and planned to steal my home. 23 minutes of her friends laughing about the confused old lady upstairs who had no idea she was being robbed. I listened to it 3 times that night, and each time, my resolve grew stronger. Harold introduced me to Maria Santos, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. Maria was probably 40, sharp-eyed and direct, with the kind of competence that inspired immediate confidence. Mrs. Holloway, she said, reviewing the documentation Harold had provided, this is one of the clearest cases of systematic theft I've seen. Your daughter-in-law didn't even try to hide the money trail. She set up new accounts in her name only, deposited the proceeds from selling your possessions, and used those funds for personal expenses. We can trace every transaction. She showed me printouts of bank records, auction house receipts, online sales confirmations. My entire collection, itemized and priced, and sold like any other commodity. The brass compass, sold to BostonAntiques.com for $847.99 on March 15th. The ivory letter opener, sold through Philadelphia State's auction house for $1,247 on March 22nd. The porcelain figurines, sold individually through various online platforms between April 1st and April 30th. Total proceeds $3,156.78. Line after line, piece after piece, my life converted to numbers in Clara's personal account. The total value of liquidated assets is just over $23,000, Maria concluded. But that's just the documented sales. There may be additional items that were sold through private channels or haven't been traced yet. $23,000. That's what my memories were worth to her. That's what 40 years of careful collecting, of loving curation, of building a legacy meant when it was reduced to cash. But you know what? I wasn't hurt by that number. I was energized by it. Because $23,000 was grand theft in our state. $23,000 was serious jail time. $23,000 was enough to destroy Clara's life the way she'd tried to destroy mine. What's our next step? I asked. Maria and Harold exchanged glances. We could go to the police now, Harold said. We have enough evidence to press criminal charges. But if you're willing to wait a little longer, to endure a bit more of her manipulation, we might be able to catch her in an even bigger crime. What do you mean? She's planning to steal your house, Maria said bluntly. We've seen the preliminary paperwork she's had drawn up. A deed transfer, putting the property in your son's name only, with Clara listed as beneficiary. If we let her make that attempt, if we catch her in the act of trying to steal your home, the charges become much more serious. I thought about it. Going home to that woman every day, pretending to be confused and grateful while she planned the final theft of everything I owned. Watching my son unknowingly participate in my destruction. Enduring more weeks or months of being diminished and controlled and erased. How much longer? I asked. Based on the paperwork timeline, probably 6 to 8 weeks, Harold said. I know it's a lot to ask, Evelyn. But if we can get her on attempted real estate fraud as well as the antique theft, we're looking at felony charges that could put her away for years. I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Howard, about what he would want me to do. And then I smiled. Let's catch her stealing my house, I said. Let's get her for everything. Those next 6 weeks were the hardest of my life. Every day, I had to wake up and pretend to be grateful to the woman who was robbing me. I had to smile when she made decisions about my life without consulting me. I had to nod appreciatively when she explained how she was protecting me from my own confusion. But I also spent those weeks gathering evidence. I photographed every document she asked me to sign. I recorded every conversation about my declining capacity and need for assistance. I documented every instance of her speaking for me, deciding for me, controlling me. And I planned. Harold helped me contact my other children, Lydia and Marcus, both of whom lived across the country and hadn't been around to witness Clara's gradual takeover of my life. I'd spoken to them less frequently over the past 2 years, partly because Clara often answered the phone and forgot to give me their messages, and partly because I'd been too ashamed to admit how completely I'd lost control of my own life. But when I finally called them directly, using Harold's office phone while Clara thought I was at a doctor's appointment, their response was immediate and fierce. "Mom," Lydia said, her voice tight with anger, "why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have helped. We could have stopped this." I didn't know how, I admitted. She made it seem like I was the problem, like I was declining and needed help. She made me doubt my own perceptions. Marcus was even more direct. "We're coming home. Whatever you need, however we can help, we're there." But I asked them to wait. To let me handle it my way, with Harold's help, using the law to get justice instead of just family confrontation. "Trust me," I said. "I know what I'm doing." And I did. For the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly what I was doing. The opportunity came on a Tuesday evening in late November. Ethan came over for dinner, which had become a weekly ritual, though lately Clara dominated the conversation with talk of my needs and practical decisions and planning for the future. That night, she brought a folder of documents. "Mom," she said, setting the papers in front of me with practice care, "we've been thinking about ways to make your life easier. To protect you from having to worry about property taxes and maintenance and all the stress of homeownership." Ethan nodded along, his face earnest with concern. "Mom, this house is getting to be too much for you. Clara's found some beautiful senior communities nearby. Places where you'd have help when you need it, but still maintain your independence." The thing is, Clara continued smoothly, to qualify for the best communities, to get the financial assistance that might be available, it would help if the house were in Ethan's name. Just temporarily, just to optimize your asset structure for maximum benefit. She was good, I'll give her that. She made theft sound like financial planning. She made my son believe he was helping me by helping her steal my home. I don't understand, I said, playing my part perfectly. This is my home. Howard and I bought this house 40 years ago. Of course it's your home, Mom, Ethan said gently. This wouldn't change that. You'd still live here as long as you want. It's just a matter of paperwork, of making sure everything is arranged in the most advantageous way. Clara spread the documents across my kitchen table, the same table where Howard and I had shared breakfast every morning for decades. Deed transfer forms, power of attorney updates, financial asset reorganization papers. My entire life, ready to be signed away. We just need your signature in a few places, Clara said, offering me a pen. I've marked all the spots. It's really just a formality. I took the pen, held it over the first document, and looked up at my son. My eldest child, the baby I'd nursed and raised and loved with everything in me, now unknowingly participating in my destruction because he trusted the woman he'd married. Ethan, I said quietly, do you really think this is what your father would want? His face crumpled slightly. Mom, Dad would want you to be safe and cared for. He'd want you to have help managing everything. He'd want what's best for you. And you think signing my house over to you is what's best for me? It's not signing it over, Clara interjected quickly. It's just restructuring ownership for tax and benefit purposes. You maintain all residential rights. It's really a very common strategy for people in your situation. People in my situation. Elderly. Declining. Burdensome. That's how she saw me, how she'd taught my son to see me. I set down the pen. I think, I said carefully, I'd like to have my lawyer review these documents before I sign anything. Clara's smile flickered, just for a second. Mom, these are pretty standard forms. I had them prepared by a legal service. There's really nothing complicated about them. Nevertheless, I said, my voice growing stronger, I think I'd prefer to have Harold look them over. Just to be safe. Harold Lopez? Ethan asked. Mom, isn't he pretty old? Are you sure he's still practicing? He's practicing enough, I said, standing up from the table. I think that's enough for tonight. I'm tired. Clara gathered up the papers quickly, but not before I saw the frustration in her eyes. Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. We can discuss this again when you've had a chance to rest. After they left, I called Harold from my landline. She took the bait, I said. She tried to get me to sign over the house tonight. Perfect. Did you sign anything? Not a thing. But Harold, seeing those documents, they looked very official. If I were really confused, really declining, I might have signed them. That's exactly what she was counting on. But now we have her on attempted real estate fraud. Tomorrow, we call the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything that had led to this moment, all the small surrenders and gradual erosions that had brought me to the edge of losing everything. I thought about Howard, about whether I was honoring his memory or betraying it by fighting back so hard. But then I remembered something he'd told me once, near the end of his life when he was worried about leaving me alone. Evelyn, he'd said, holding my hand in his hospital bed, promise me something. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you smaller than you are. You're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more valuable than anyone could ever appreciate. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. I'd made that promise, and I intended to keep it. The police came at 10 o'clock the next morning. 2 detectives, one young and one probably around Ethan's age, both professional and respectful as Harold introduced them and explained the situation. Detective Morrison, the older one, took the lead. Mrs. Holloway, we understand you want to press charges against your daughter-in-law for theft and elder fraud. Can you walk us through what happened? So I did. I told them everything, from Clara's initial charm to her gradual isolation tactics to the systematic theft of my possessions. I showed them the recordings, the bank statements, the auction receipts. I explained about the power of attorney that had been obtained through manipulation, about the attempted deed transfer, about 2 years of psychological abuse designed to make me doubt my own competence. Detective Martinez, the younger one, took careful notes and asked good questions. Mrs. Holloway, you seem very clear and competent to me. Has anyone ever suggested otherwise? Has your daughter-in-law ever claimed you were suffering from dementia or mental decline? Constantly, I said. She's spent 2 years establishing a narrative that I'm confused and forgetful and need her help to function. She's convinced my son that I'm declining, that I need protection from my own poor judgment. And your son believes this? I thought about Ethan, about his worried face the night before when he'd tried to get me to sign away my house. My son loves me, but he's been manipulated just as thoroughly as I have, just in a different way. Clara has convinced him that controlling me is the same as caring for me. The detectives exchanged glances. We're going to need to interview your daughter-in-law. And your son. This is going to be difficult for your family, Mrs. Holloway. Are you prepared for that? I was. I'd been preparing for it for weeks, steeling myself for the moment when my carefully gathered evidence would finally be used to seek justice. Detective Morrison, I said, I'm 70 years old. I buried my husband 3 years ago. I've lived through the Depression, 2 wars, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Kennedy assassination. I've raised 3 children, survived breast cancer, and managed to build a life worth living despite everything the world could throw at me. I'm prepared for whatever comes next. He smiled. I believe you are, ma'am. They arrested Clara at her office. I wasn't there to see it, but Harold called me with the details later that afternoon. She'd been meeting with a client, discussing a home staging project, when the detectives arrived with handcuffs and a warrant. The charges were extensive: grand theft, elder abuse, financial fraud, attempted real estate fraud, and conspiracy. The prosecutor was confident they could make all of them stick. What about Ethan? I asked Harold. Is he in trouble too? The police questioned him extensively. He's cooperating fully with the investigation. As far as they can tell, he was as much a victim of Clara's manipulation as you were. She convinced him he was protecting you when he was actually helping her rob you. My son, my poor, well-meaning son, who'd thought he was being a good son by trusting his wife's judgment about my care. Who'd thought he was helping me by helping her control me. That evening, Ethan came to the house. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. His face was gray with shock and grief, his hands shaking as he sat across from me in my living room. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought I was helping you. I thought Clara was helping you. I reached across and took his hands in mine. They were cold, trembling with the weight of what he'd learned about the woman he'd married. Ethan, you were manipulated. She's very good at manipulation. She made you believe that controlling me was the same as protecting me. But I should have known. I should have seen what she was doing. You're my mother. I should have protected you instead of helping her hurt you. You couldn't have known, I said gently. She's a professional, Ethan. This is what she does. I've been researching her since yesterday, working with the police. Clara's real name is Christine Morrison. She's been married 3 times before, always to older men or men with elderly parents. She has a pattern of isolating vulnerable people and stealing their assets. His face crumpled. 3 times? This isn't the first time she's done this. No, sweetheart. You weren't her first victim, and I wasn't either. We were just her most recent marks. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what had happened. How completely we'd both been fooled, how systematically our family had been destroyed. What happens now? Ethan asked finally. Now we rebuild, I said. We take back control of our lives. We learn to trust ourselves again. Can you forgive me, Mom? Can you ever forgive me for what I helped her do to you? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be kind and trusting and caring, whose good heart had been weaponized against both of us by a woman who understood exactly how to exploit love. Ethan, I said, there's nothing to forgive. We were both victims. But we're not victims anymore. The trial took 8 months. 8 months of depositions and hearings and evidence presentations. 8 months of reliving every manipulation, every theft, every moment of being made to feel small and confused and grateful for abuse. But also 8 months of justice slowly, methodically being served. The prosecutor was a woman named Janet Kim, probably in her 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that made me glad she was on my side. She understood elder abuse cases, understood how financial predators operated, understood the psychology of systematic manipulation. Mrs. Holloway, she told me during one of our preparation meetings, your case is going to help a lot of other people. The evidence you gathered, the recordings you made, the documentation you provided, it's going to set precedent for how we prosecute these kinds of crimes. Clara's defense attorney tried to paint me as a confused old woman who had misunderstood her daughter-in-law's helpful intentions. They claimed I'd given verbal permission for the sale of my antiques, that I'd been grateful for Clara's assistance in decluttering my life. But the recordings destroyed that narrative. My voice on those tapes was clear, confident, and increasingly suspicious of Clara's activities. The financial records showed a clear pattern of theft, not authorized assistance. The testimony of the forensic accountant proved that Clara had systematically converted my assets for her personal use. Most damning of all was the attempted deed transfer. There was no way to spin that as anything other than an attempt to steal my house. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours to review 2 years' worth of evidence, to consider the testimonies of experts and family members and law enforcement. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless and angry for too long. Clara was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution for everything she'd stolen. The judge was particularly harsh about the psychological abuse, the systematic isolation and manipulation. Mrs. Morrison, the judge said, they'd discovered her real name during the investigation. Elder abuse is among the most despicable crimes in our legal system. You didn't just steal money or possessions. You stole dignity, autonomy, and peace of mind from a woman who had welcomed you into her family with open arms. The court hopes that your time in prison will give you opportunity to reflect on the pain you've caused. 8 years. It wouldn't give me back my antiques, wouldn't undo the damage to my relationship with Ethan, wouldn't erase the months of feeling like I was disappearing in my own home. But it was justice. And justice, I've learned, is its own kind of healing. The restitution money, $23,000 plus interest and penalties, came through 6 months after the sentencing. I used part of it to upgrade my home security system, to change all the locks, to reclaim my space completely. But most of it went toward something Howard would have loved, a scholarship fund for art history students at the local university, specifically for those studying antique preservation and family heritage documentation. The Holloway Memorial Fund for Cultural Preservation, I named it. Because Clara could steal our things, but she couldn't steal our values. She couldn't steal our commitment to preserving history for future generations. Ethan and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. He moved back into his old apartment after Clara's arrest, started therapy to process his own victimization, began the long work of learning to trust his own judgment again. He volunteers at the University Museum now, helping with their antique restoration program. He says it helps him feel connected to his father, helps him understand what we lost when Clara sold our collection. I'll never be able to replace what she stole, he told me recently. But maybe I can help preserve other people's heritage. Maybe I can make sure other families don't lose their history the way we lost ours. We have dinner together once a week now, just the two of us. No one hovering, no one monitoring our conversation, no one deciding what's appropriate for me to eat or wear or say. Just a mother and son, slowly learning to trust each other again. My other children, Lydia and Marcus, visit more often now. They help me maintain my independence while respecting my autonomy. They check on me without controlling me, offer assistance without taking over. It's a delicate balance, this business of aging with dignity. But I'm learning that the key isn't avoiding help when you need it. It's making sure the help comes from people who see you as whole, competent, and valuable. I've started hosting my old friends again. Bridge games on Wednesday afternoons, book club on Friday evenings, impromptu dinners whenever the mood strikes. My house feels alive again, filled with conversation and laughter and the kinds of connections that make life worth living. I've also started speaking at senior centers about financial elder abuse, about recognizing the warning signs of manipulation and control. Too many people my age have been convinced that needing help means surrendering autonomy, that accepting care means accepting diminishment. You have the right to age with dignity, I tell them. You have the right to make your own decisions, even if other people think those decisions are wrong. You have the right to be respected, to be heard, to be valued for who you are, not dismissed for how old you are. It's important work. Necessary work. Because Clara isn't unique. There are predators everywhere who see aging as vulnerability, who see elderly people as easy marks for financial and emotional manipulation. But there are also allies. People like Harold and Maria and Detective Morrison and Prosecutor Kim, who understand that elder abuse is a serious crime that deserves serious consequences. People who see elderly victims not as confused and declining, but as strong and valuable members of society who deserve protection and justice. I want you to understand something. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I don't need your pity or your concern about my advanced age or your worry about my living situation. I tell this story because I want you to understand that being elderly doesn't mean being powerless. Being trusting doesn't mean being stupid. Being victimized doesn't mean being weak. I tell this story because someone needs to say out loud that elder abuse is real, that it happens to smart, capable people, that it's often perpetrated by family members or people in positions of trust. I tell this story because Clara thought my age made me an easy target, and she was wrong. She thought she could isolate me, control me, diminish me until I forgot who I was. She thought she could steal my history, my autonomy, my dignity, and I would be too confused or too grateful to fight back. She was wrong about that too. At 70 years old, I am still Evelyn Margaret Holloway. I am still the woman who worked her way through college in the 1950s when most women weren't expected to work at all. I am still the woman who raised 3 children and buried a husband and survived cancer and built a life worth living. I am still the woman who chose every piece in that antique collection with love and care and intention. Who can tell you the story behind every item? Who knows the difference between genuine depression glass and clever reproductions? Who understands that preserving history isn't about hoarding objects, but about honoring the people who came before us. Clara took my things, but she couldn't take my knowledge. She couldn't take my experience. She couldn't take my strength. And when she finally showed her true face, when she finally made the mistake of thinking I was too diminished to defend myself, I was ready for her. I want you to remember that, the next time you interact with someone my age. We're not just elderly. We're not just declining. We're not just problems to be managed or burdens to be endured. We're people with lifetimes of experience, with hard-won wisdom, with stories worth telling and lives worth respecting. We're people who have survived everything the world could throw at us and are still here, still fighting, still valuable. And if you try to steal from us, if you try to diminish us, if you try to make us smaller than we are, well, you might discover that age has taught us patience, but it's also taught us exactly how much we're willing to tolerate. Clara learned that lesson the hard way. 8 years in prison is a long time to think about the woman she underestimated. I hope she uses that time wisely. I hope she learns that respect isn't something you can steal. It's something you have to earn. As for me, I'm 70 years old, and I'm done being afraid. I'm done being grateful for treatment that diminishes me. I'm done pretending to be confused when I'm actually just being ignored. I'm ready for whatever comes next. Because if this experience has taught me anything, it's that I'm stronger than I knew, braver than I believed, and more valuable than anyone who tries to diminish me could ever understand. And that, my friends, is worth more than any antique collection could ever be. Howard was right all those years ago. True treasures can't be stolen. They live in your heart, in your memories, in your determination to remain fully yourself no matter what the world tries to take from you. Clara thought she was stealing my past. Instead, she gave me back my future.